The neon sign outside the front has been buzzing a little louder these past few nights. The parking lot is filling up fast, fresh cars pulling in, dust still settling behind them. New travellers stepping out into the glow, looking up at the sky as if expecting something to move. The Dreamland Motel hasn't been this busy in a long time. If you're one of the many who've wandered in after watching The Age of Disclosure, searching for a place to process whatever that film stirred in you, welcome. You're in good company. Because the truth is, you don't need to know every twist and turn of the last 70 years to feel the weight of this moment. Disclosure, if it really is on the horizon, might happen long before you have time to digest everything that's come before it. You don't need a history lesson, or a conspiracy catalogue, or a crash course in acronyms and mythology. What you need, what so many people are looking for right now, is a way to think about disclosure, a way to navigate the noise, to make sense of new information as it arrives, to understand what matters and what doesn't, in a world that feels like it's inching toward something unprecedented. So tonight's episode isn't a look back, it's a guide forward, a map for the newly arrived, a compass for the long-time wanderers, not a summary of where we've been, but a quiet way to understand where we might be heading, and why the ground under our feet feels like it's starting to shift. But before we set off down this road together, let me gently invite you to do the usual. If you find yourself drifting off to these late-night conversations, if you're curious where this journey will lead, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the little bell at the front desk so you don't miss the next chapter. It helps more travellers find their way here, to this strange little motel on the edge of everything, where the lights are always on and the questions only get deeper. Tonight, you'll be staying in room 34. Now, let's step inside. Disclosure is one of those rare ideas that carries more definitions than syllables. Ask 10 people what it means, and you'll get 10 very different answers, each one shaped by their hopes, their fears, and whatever headline they scrolled past at 2:14 in the morning. So before we try to understand whether disclosure is happening, or whether we're already living inside it, let's slow down, breathe, and lay out the landscape. Because disclosure isn't one road, it's a crossroads, and depending on which path someone imagines, they may already believe it's happened, or that it hasn't even begun. Number 1. Event disclosure. This is the classic image: a podium, a seal of government, a leader addressing the world with a steady voice and a trembling teleprompter. The moment that splits history into before and after. Event disclosure is cinematic, singular, unmistakable, a flashpoint, a line in the timeline. For many, this is what the word disclosure means, and has always meant. 2. Process disclosure. Others see disclosure not as a single moment, but as a sequence. A leak, a hearing, a whistleblower, a classified program revealed, a new acronym appearing in a government memo, language softening, tone shifting, doors opening 1 inch at a time. Process disclosure is slow, bureaucratic, almost geological. The truth emerges in sediment layers, not lightning bolts. 3. Environmental disclosure. The third kind, the one most people only notice in hindsight. A cultural shift, a world where secrecy gradually loses gravity. A civilization that starts treating the existence of non-human intelligence not as a shock, but as a possibility that quietly settles into the background of daily life. No announcements, no podiums, just a collective widening of the Overton window, until the unimaginable becomes mundane. Environmental disclosure is atmospheric. It's not something that happens, it's something you realize. There's a very important distinction here I'd like to make early on. Disclosure is human, a reckoning, a release, a gradual alignment between what is known privately and what is spoken publicly. Contact is different. Contact isn't policy. It's not narrative. It's not the dissemination of secrets. Contact is the moment the universe answers back. Disclosure is internal. Contact is external. NHI, landing uninvited on the White House lawn, is always a possibility, but it's not the topic of tonight's discussion. These 3 models, event, process, and environmental, are not competing definitions. They're lenses, ways of seeing, ways of understanding what people mean when they say disclosure is coming, or has already arrived, or may never occur at all. And now that we've laid them out, we can finally turn toward the deeper question. Which one are we talking about tonight? Because for so many people, myself included, disclosure feels like a defining moment, the kind of hinge in history that textbooks would name in bold type. And yet, we need to realize, history rarely moves in moments. Not really. We like to say the Berlin Wall fell, as if decades of political, economic, and social decay didn't crack it long before the concrete hit the ground. We say the Soviet Union collapsed, as if it wasn't unraveling in plain sight for years. We talk about the discovery of the New World, as if centuries of exploration didn't precede it. Moments are how we remember history. Ages are how we live through it. And within ufology, there's a familiar saying. Disclosure has already happened. Because when you look at the last few years, it's hard to argue with the surface level logic. We have admirals, program directors, intelligence officials, aerospace insiders, government scientists, and even a Secretary of State telling us publicly that non-human intelligence is interacting with humanity, that we have craft, that we have biologics. If you whispered that sentence into your ear 10 years ago, your past self would probably say, well, that's disclosure. That's the moment. And yet here we are. Coffee is still overpriced. Rent is still too damn high. Mariah Carey still returns every December, like a seasonal comet. And society hasn't shifted the way you'd expect if we were truly living in the aftermath of a civilizational revelation. Which brings us to an important analogy. the fall of the Berlin Wall really was a moment, a turning point in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. It symbolized the end of the stranglehold Moscow held over Eastern Europe, and for many people living there, that very night was the end of the Soviet Union in their lives. But the age that contained it stretched far beyond that single evening. Long before the crowds gathered with hammers, long before the first chips of concrete fell, the collapse was already in motion. And it wasn't until a year after the wall came down that East and West Germany were officially reunified. It wasn't for another 2 years that the Bela-Vieja Accords were signed, the document that formally ended the Soviet Union. But by then, the Union had already died. That signing was less an execution and more the issuance of a death certificate. And the same may be true now. There can be an age of disclosure without yet having had the moment of disclosure. We can see the writing on the wall. The age is the erosion of secrecy, the shift in culture, the credibility of the voices coming forward, the quiet acknowledgement from those who have seen the data. But have we had our Berlin Wall moment? In my opinion, no. Our defining moment, the one my generation imagined, is something else entirely. It is when the truth is spoken by those with the authority to speak it, on behalf of civilization itself. The Secretary of State carries enormous weight, but in the film The Age of Disclosure, he was not standing at a podium. He was not acting in an official capacity. He was not representing humanity. He was offering testimony, not delivering disclosure. And so, for me, and perhaps for you, the moment of disclosure remains ahead of us. If the NHI themselves do not make the introduction, then it will fall to our elected leaders to step into that most cliched, most mythic, most world-altering scene imaginable. A podium, a camera, a silent room, and the words, "We are not alone." Until that day arrives, we may indeed be in the age of disclosure, but the moment is still waiting, quietly, somewhere behind the curtain. So why are we talking about this now? Because, for all intents and purposes, a very important film has just been released. Important not because of special effects or production value or marketing hype, though it does have many of those things, but because of who is in it, because of what they said, and because of when they chose to say it. The tone of the film is calm, almost restrained, and yet the weight of the testimony it contained is anything but. Over 30 people, military officers, analysts, program insiders, intelligence officials, policymakers, sitting in front of cameras and saying things that, even 5 years ago, would have sounded like the fever dreams of message boards and midnight radio. There is a point, and I think we crossed it somewhere in the last year, where testimony stops being interesting, stops being provocative, and starts becoming something else altogether. Cumulative. Not scientifically proven, not peer-reviewed, certainly not settled fact, but something closer to the standard used in the most serious room in society, a courtroom, beyond all reasonable doubt. If this were a jury trial, we might already be approaching that threshold, not because the evidence has been placed on a projector, but because the witnesses themselves carry the kind of credibility that collapses the probability space. At some point, to believe all of them are wrong requires a theory stranger than the phenomenon they're describing. That admirals are lying in sync, that generals are delusional in unison, that scientists, policymakers, and career intelligence officers from entirely different departments somehow coordinated their hallucinations, that somehow we're all orbiting the same black hole, feeling the pull of a singularity that doesn't exist. Now, is that possible? Of course. Human beings are fallible. Groups can misinterpret. Good people can be misled. And it's always possible, in a topic this charged, that some mixture of misdirection, misunderstanding, and misplaced certainty is at play. But the question becomes inescapable. What have these people seen? What crossed their desks? What crossed their minds? What conversations did they walk into that changed the way they speak in public today? What did Marco Rubio see? What did Carl Nell see? What did the program managers and analysts see? Was it nothing? Were they drip-fed the same rumours, the same fragments, the same second-hand stories the public has been cycling through for decades? Or do we finally accept the uncomfortable possibility? Did their security clearances unlock a level of access most of us can scarcely imagine? If we choose to believe them, even provisionally, that answer appears to be yes. The funny thing is, those clearances didn't just grant them proximity to secrets. They granted them proximity to evidence. Evidence the public has never seen. Evidence that, in theory, should resolve the question cleanly. If it's ours, it's ours. A classified aerospace project. A technological edge. Case closed. Patriotic shrug. Move on. But it isn't playing out that way. Because, the deeper they go, the more they are shown, not rumours, not fragments, not stories recycled from UFO subreddits, but testimony and material presented by people who have been thoroughly vetted, professionally evaluated, and quietly ushered into skiffs with the understanding that the stakes are real. And instead of dissolving their belief, that access has deepened it. The more they've seen, the less they think this is ours. The more they've listened, the less they believe this is human. The closer they've gotten to the classified edge of the map, the more convinced they've become that something otherworldly is happening just beyond it. Either that, or they're lying. Tonight, we're not ready for conclusions. We're not here to decide whether the film is right or wrong, true or untrue, groundbreaking or misguided. That part comes later. Right now, here in room 34, we're only acknowledging the moment. That this film arrived at a time when the world was already leaning toward disclosure, and it landed like a stone dropped into a lake, where the water was already trembling. We'll return to the film later on, after we've laid out the full puzzle, after we've examined the past, the present, and the forces pushing us toward the future. And indeed, I have a few things I'd like to say. If you've spent any amount of time in ufology, you might feel the quiet pressure of a strange déjà vu, as though we've all stood on this threshold before, as though countless others walked this same hallway, paused at the same door, and whispered to themselves, "This is it. It's finally happening." Disclosure has felt just a few months away, not once, not twice, but again and again across the last 70 years. Every generation has had its moment, its swell of anticipation, and its near miss, and each time the world seemed to hold its breath. Let me take you on a small tour of these ghosts. 1952. Lights over Washington. Imagine the capital city in the summer heat. Phone lines jammed. Newspapers running full-page headlines about flying saucers over the White House. Jets scrambled. Radar blips dancing across screens. Pilots reporting impossible maneuvers. People genuinely believed the president was about to make an announcement. This wasn't fringe. This was front page. And when the Pentagon held an emergency press conference, many expected disclosure. It didn't come. In the 1960s, Congress actually held UFO hearings. Yes, real hearings. Actual lawmakers, military officials, scientists, all discussing unidentified craft in public chambers. NICAP, APRO, credentialed investigators, they pushed and pushed, convinced they were on the edge of a breakthrough. Some members of Congress privately told them, "You're close, keep going." And yet, after all the hearings, after all the advocacy, silence. 1989, Lazar and the Shadows of Area 51. A different kind of ghost. A man on television claiming he had worked on recovered alien craft in the Nevada desert. S4, gravity propulsion, element 115. For many, this wasn't a story. It was a spark that ignited a belief that revelation was imminent. If someone this close had spoken, others would surely follow. Surely the government couldn't hold this wall forever. People waited for the next insider, for the next leak, for confirmation. It didn't arrive. Not then. The 1990s. Roswell rises again. Half a century after the crash, half a century after the US Army admitted it had recovered a flying saucer, the only official disclosure we've ever received, before it was hastily rescinded the very next day. Roswell returned like a buried fossil pushed to the surface. New witnesses, new documentaries, congressional representatives demanding answers, a GAO, General Accounting Office, investigation, and an official Air Force response. Many believed, this time they have to tell us what happened. And when the government finally spoke, their words felt strangely hollow. Another cycle, another breath held and released. 2013, the citizen hearing on disclosure. For one surreal week in Washington, former members of Congress sat on a panel listening to pilots, officers, researchers testify about UFOs as though the real hearing the world had been waiting for was finally happening. For those in attendance, it felt like history, like a soft disclosure, unofficial but undeniable. But outside those doors, nothing changed. The world carried on. The ghost faded. 2017. The New York Times breaks the silence. This one felt different. A secret Pentagon program exposed. Military videos released. Navy pilots describing impossible craft. Government agencies admitting on the record that UAP are real, and they don't know what they are. It was the kind of story that in any other decade might have triggered global shock. But instead, the world blinked and scrolled on. And yet, within the UFO community, hope surged again. This is it. This is the turning point. In many ways, it might have been. But no disclosure. Not quite. Not yet. 2023. Congress once more. For the first time in over 50 years, Congress opened the doors again. Fravor, Graves, Grush. Decorated pilots speaking of craft that defy known physics. A whistleblower hinting at crash retrieval programs, non-human biologics, classified compartments beyond oversight. For a moment, the air felt electric, as though the world was about to tilt. People said, "It's happening. This is the beginning of the end of secrecy." But the hearing ended, the cameras switched off, and no new evidence was produced. The cycle continued. Why does this keep happening? Why do we keep approaching the edge, only to stop just short of the drop? Why does every generation feel the same rising tension, the same certainty that the moment is near, only for it to dissolve into background noise again? Is it human psychology? Institutional inertia? The nature of the phenomenon itself? Or something else? Something about the time we lived in, the state of the world, the tools we had, the transparency we lacked. Whatever the reason, one truth becomes impossible for me to ignore. We're not the first to feel disclosure breathing down our necks. Not by a long shot. And yet, there is also something undeniably different about the moment we're living in now. Something we'll return to. But not yet. For now, hold those ghosts close. Remember their shape, their timing, their patterns. Because to understand the future of disclosure, we have to understand the long shadow it casts behind us, and why so many before us thought they were standing right where we stand today. Disclosure predictions don't only come from hearings in Washington, or whistleblowers stepping out of the desert. For as long as people have been looking at the sky, there are those who've believed, sincerely, fervently, that the moment of revelation was almost here, that something was coming, that something was imminent, that we were standing on the edge of the extraordinary. And if you listen closely to the history of the topic, you'll hear the echoes everywhere. Because long before congressional oversight and classified briefings, there were people who spoke of contact, prophecy, transformation, and a coming shift that would change everything, not as rumour, but as revelation. Yes, their claims often carried mystical or theological weight. And yes, many of their timelines collapsed under scrutiny. But these stories are still disclosure stories, even if disclosure never arrived. They are truths spoken internally, before any external confirmation. Human attempts to articulate a future that hadn't yet materialized. And maybe that tells us something deeper, not just about the phenomenon, but about ourselves. That we have a persistent, almost instinctive belief that history is about to pivot, that an old age is ending, and a new one is waiting just beyond the threshold. We'll talk about that longing in a moment, but for now, it's worth spending time with the voices who felt certain they could see the horizon line, even when no one else could. Chris Bledsoe, Easter 2026. A man who says he met a radiant lady of light. A man who believes a moment of great significance will arrive around Easter 2026. He doesn't say what will happen, only that something magic is coming, and that the world will not be the same. The followers of Bledsoe aren't waiting for a press conference. They're waiting for an omen, a sign, a shift in the fabric of whatever this phenomenon truly is. It is spiritual, experiential, a prophecy of meaning, not policy. Then there are those like Dr. Stephen Greer, who always seems to live one news cycle ahead of disclosure. Within 30 days, within 72 hours, on the verge of major announcements. Greer has been forecasting imminent breakthroughs for decades. Sometimes he speaks in terms of classified materials about to surface, pilots preparing to come forward, or governments on the brink of telling the truth. Greer's predictions aren't spiritual, they're bureaucratic, institutional. The hope that someone in power is finally about to say the quiet part out loud. To be clear, I'm not here to dismiss him. On the whole, I'm a supporter of Greer. Whatever one thinks of his style or his certainty, he organised one of the most consequential events ever to occur in modern ufology. The aptly named Disclosure Project, a gathering of high-ranking whistleblowers, military personnel, intelligence officers, and government contractors who didn't just suggest the existence of non-human intelligence, but alleged a long-standing, illegal, and deeply entrenched cover-up, stretching back half a century. Greer has helped shape some of the most pivotal moments in this field. He has changed the conversation, amplified voices few others could access, and pushed the topic onto stages that would have otherwise never entertained it. But at the same time, it's not unreasonable to say that he's been over-ambitious in some of his forecasts of imminent government disclosure. Then again, who am I to say? I'm speaking from the sideline. Love him or hate him, Greer has been in the thick of this since before I was born, and he's still out there, still pushing, still convinced the moment is close. And whether that confidence is prescience or persistence, it remains one of the defining energies driving the modern disclosure movement. And then there were the more dramatic movements. Heaven's Gate, waiting for a spacecraft behind a comet. The Raelians, preparing diplomatic embassies for the Elohim. Unarius, predicting starships descending in the year 2001. Some of these groups faded gently. Some ended in tragedy. But all were built upon the same foundation, the belief that a grand transformation was imminent, and that they, uniquely, knew the timetable. Skeptics often argue that this recurring anticipation is nothing but a human coping mechanism, the desire to escape the mundane, the longing to feel special, the instinct to impose narrative on the unknown. Psychologists like Leon Festinger, who studied the 1950s UFO prophecy groups, suggested something similar, that people cling harder to predictions when they begin to crumble, because the belief itself becomes a lifeline. And yes, there is a psychological appeal to certainty, to knowing what comes next, to believing that history has a plan, and that we're living in the chapter just before the big reveal. But reducing all of this to people want to feel chosen is too easy, too shallow, too dismissive. It ignores the sincerity of the experiences and the depth of their encounters, the honesty with which they describe the inexplicable things they saw. In my opinion, it also ignores the very real possibility that someone, someday, will actually get it right. If enough people make enough predictions over enough time, chance alone suggests that eventually one of them will align with reality. And then what happens? Will we recognize it as a coincidence, prophecy, statistical inevitability, or a sign of something divine? Perhaps a combination. The truth is, prediction has always been intertwined with ufology. In every era, someone has insisted that next year, next season, next month holds a revelation. Even right now, there are dozens of popular dates circulating quietly online. At the time of writing, you can watch in real time the 3-Eye Atlas predictions slowly fading into obscurity. Then there's Easter 2026 for Bledsoe. Every year in Greer's telling. And 2027, the year that many theorists whisper about, due to classified briefings that hinted the timeline is shorter than you think. Whether any of these dates mean anything remains to be seen, but they all point to the same human impulse, to seek meaning in the mystery, to anchor uncertainty to a moment in time, and to believe that something vast is approaching. And in a way, that instinct is not foolish at all. It's human, it's ancient, it's got us this far, and it's part of why this topic has survived, generation after generation, regardless of how many predictions evaporated in the dawn. This chapter isn't here to mock prophecy, or to wave away the people who made them. It's here because every generation before us has stood where we're standing now, believing disclosure was close enough to touch. And if we don't understand that lineage, if we don't acknowledge how many times the horizon has shimmered with promise, only to fade, then we can't understand the weight of the moment we're living in today. Because here's the truth buried beneath all these stories. We didn't look back to prove everyone wrong. We looked back to understand why, for the first time, so many people feel something different in the air. The long history of missed predictions, the false starts, the fevered timelines that came and went, those were the echoes. But what we're living in now, it doesn't feel like an echo. It feels like pressure building, like systems shifting, like a world quietly preparing for something it doesn't yet have the language to explain. And that contrast, between decades of prophecy that never quite materialized, and the unprecedented conditions unfolding right now, is the reason we took this detour through history, because we cannot appreciate the gravity of the present without understanding the ghosts of the past. And so, we finally turn the question around. After so many false dawns, why does this moment feel different? Imagine humanity standing on a set of railway tracks, and there's a freight train coming. Not because of UFOs or whistleblowers, or secret craft in hangars or bodies in vaults, but because the world itself is changing, in ways that are too big, too fast, and too interconnected to stop. Disclosure, if it happens, may not arrive as a philosophical choice, or a moral awakening, or a compassionate gesture from the institutions that kept secrets. It may arrive because the momentum of history is about to bulldoze everything in its path. For the first time in history, we are creating something that may outthink us, out-strategize us, and eventually out-govern us. AI will rewrite economics, labor, media, medicine, warfare, and cognition itself. And institutions that depend on secrecy are suddenly confronted with a terrifying problem: a world where secrets become impossible. The game of who knows what is becoming automated, scalable, and instantaneous. And if there really are decades of hidden knowledge locked behind compartmented walls, someone, somewhere, is already predicting the moment AI becomes capable of tearing those walls open. In other news, the planet is heating, migration is accelerating, resource competition is escalating, and entire regions are destabilizing. This isn't a future crisis, it's a present one. And in the eras of environmental disruption, human societies historically enter periods of political upheaval, radicalization, and system-level transformation. To put it simply, the old ways crack, and power structures scramble to justify themselves in the face of urgency. Disclosure in this context would be less about wonder and more about narrative control, a new story of reality to stabilize a collapsing one. The world needs more energy than ever, but the fuel sources that built the 20th century cannot sustain the 21st. The grids strain, the planet warms, the maths stops working. We are nearing a civilization-scale bottleneck. Either energy becomes radically cheaper, cleaner, and denser, or geopolitical instability becomes existential. If there is even a fragment of truth to recovered technology, exotic propulsion, or energy systems beyond combustion, there are powerful people who may be thinking, if not now, when? Because the timeline for doing nothing really is running out. Elsewhere, global political power is shifting. Empires are creaking, new alliances are forming, old structures are buckling. The world is slipping from unipolar certainty into multipolar chaos. And in periods like this, governments don't reveal secrets because they want to. They reveal secrets because they need leverage. New myths, new symbols, new futures to sell to their citizens and to each other. Disclosure, framed correctly, could be marketed as proof of technological supremacy, scientific leadership, or ideological destiny. But it wouldn't be enlightenment. It would be strategy. Because I don't know whether you've noticed this too, but people do not trust governments, media, corporations, experts, or systems of authority as they once did. The narrative monopoly has shattered, and in its place, millions of competing realities now exist side by side. Conspiracy theories are no longer fringe, they are cultural gravity. In such a world, a secret of this magnitude can no longer be managed by silence alone. Containment has a half-life. Misinformation proliferates faster than truth can be controlled. And there is a point where institutions may decide that the cost of secrecy exceeds the cost of disclosure. And the world has never been more connected, more surveilled, or more incapable of hiding. Satellites track everything. Phones record everything. Leaks move at light speed. Whistleblowers go viral before breakfast. Secrecy, once an asset, is becoming a liability. If there are craft, they cannot remain invisible forever. Not because they lack the means, but because we lack the ability to look away. And if there are programs, they cannot remain compartmentalized forever. Not because they're small, but because human networks no longer stay sealed. History is moving toward visibility, whether institutions or private contractors like it or not. Add these forces together: artificial intelligence, climate destabilization, energy scarcity, political realignment, institutional collapse, and digital transparency, and you get a world accelerating toward a civilizational inflection point, a technological and cultural singularity, beyond which the old rules simply do not apply. And here is an uncomfortable truth. If UFO disclosure happens soon, it may not be because someone chose it, but because the world made it unavoidable. Secrecy is becoming brittle, reality more volatile, and the future is arriving far too fast for gatekeepers to manage the narrative indefinitely. For decades, people believed disclosure was close because they wanted it to be. They saw meaning in signs, patterns in coincidence, prophecy in uncertainty. But now, for the first time, there are forces at work that are independent of belief, indifferent to prophecy, and immune to denial. Clocks are ticking, systems are shifting, thresholds are approaching. Even without non-human intelligence, the next decade will transform humanity in ways that are difficult to overstate. And if there is an intelligence here, if there are technologies hidden in vaults, if there is knowledge withheld from history, then the intersection of those secrets with a rapidly transforming world creates a singular conclusion. Now is as good a time as any. And in some ways, it's now or never. This time feels different, because it is different. Not because we're waiting for revelation, but because the world is forcing one. Among the forces driving disclosure we've already explored, two rise to the surface with a kind of quiet inevitability: artificial intelligence, which accelerates knowledge, and the energy problem, which constrains everything else. Together, they form a loop which doesn't resemble previous technological transitions. They don't push change forward, they compel it, whether we are prepared or not. Artificial intelligence is no longer simply a tool. It is fast becoming an environment, a place where information is gathered, interpreted, and transformed at a speed that pushes against the limits of comprehension. We are building minds that can see patterns we cannot see, and make sense of complexity we cannot fathom. These systems do not need disclosure to be told to them. They do not wait for whistleblowers, or for clearance to be lifted. They ingest data the way biological organisms ingest nutrients, and they are developing the ability to extract meaning from everything they consume. Old radar logs stored on forgotten drives, grainy infrared footage that was once incomprehensible, atmospheric anomalies hidden in decades of satellite archives, conflicting pilot reports scattered across the literature. These things do not remain disconnected for long in a world of self-improving pattern recognition. There is a growing sense that, for the first time in history, secrets are not threatened by leaks, but by analysis, not by a breach of security, but by the sheer computational appetite of the systems we've created. There is also a deeper vulnerability emerging, one that sits beneath every layer of secrecy humanity currently depends on. When people think of modern encryption, they think safe and secure. But the truth is, it's never been unbreakable. It's simply expensive to break, measured in decades, centuries, or millennia of brute force. It was designed around the limitations of classical computing, the slow march of ones and zeros through silicon pathways, governed by the physical constraints of time and energy, with a dedicated machine taking up to 14 million years to crack even one encrypted message using current methods. But if that underlying language changes, if computation moves into the quantum landscape, where states can exist as many things at once, and probability replaces sequence, then the maths that once protected our secrets could collapse in a single generation. The vaults that store our most sensitive programs may one day be undone, not by whistleblowers or rogue insiders, but by the inevitable collision between secrecy and computational evolution. And this risk is not primarily about the public. It's adversarial. Whoever reaches that capability first may inherit whatever history has been locked away. Humans once controlled archives by burying them, but archives are now food for something that does not tire and does not stop. And while intelligence expands outward, another force presses inward: the limits of power. Not metaphorical power, but literal energy, the electricity required to sustain these new engines of thought. The systems we're building do not scale politely. They devour resources. Every leap in capability requires a leap in power. Every improvement in training requires greater output, cooling, infrastructure, and cost. For a century, industrial progress could always turn inward for more fuel, deeper wells, longer supply chains. larger reactors, new technologies that improve efficiency just enough to tread water for another decade. But that era is ending. The demand curve for intelligence is exponential. The supply curve for energy is not. Civilization is drifting toward a bottleneck, where the machine that must accelerate meets the grid that cannot. And once that collision arrives, it doesn't matter whether governments are prepared. Physics will become the policymaker. You may have heard of the notion of a new, secret Cold War, governed by the reverse engineering of recovered craft. I can assure you that this is that Cold War. There is no stable future where advanced AI remains modest. There is no stable future where energy remains simple. If something revolutionary already exists, some alternative pathway hidden just out of reach, it will soon become necessary to take advantage of. Which raises a deeply pragmatic question. If exotic energy technology exists behind those closed doors, how long can it realistically be withheld? Certainly not in a world where competitors may unveil theirs first. When the stakes rise high enough, revelation stops being scandalous and becomes strategic. If knowledge is released, it will not be because the public demanded the truth, or because institutions suddenly found their conscience. It will be because the need to unleash it for use in a sector providing technological advantage for its own objectives will become overwhelming. Civilizations reveal world-altering truths for the same reason they ration water, or ration currency, or ration information in wartime. Because they need to. And survival depends on timing. Rapid shock collapses systems. Gradual change preserves them. The people who manage those transitions do not think in terms of morality. They think in terms of continuity. If disclosure comes, it may not feel like mythology, or spectacle, or revelation. It may feel like the adaptation, technology surfacing because the system cannot move forward without it. The most extraordinary truth in human history may well be revealed, not because of some cosmic destiny, but simply because civilization needs a new engine to run itself on. Regardless, the age ahead is not waiting for permission. It's waiting for the capability, for energy, infrastructure, and for intelligence. Whatever secret systems exist, if of course they exist at all, will eventually collide with a world that no longer functions without them. And when that happens, disclosure will not look like a gift. It will simply look like a requirement. You may now have thought of a relatively simple question, one that sounds almost naive when spoken aloud. If advanced energy technology exists, why not reveal it without revealing the rest? Why not claim a brilliant breakthrough, a scientific revolution, a human discovery, and skip the uncomfortable part about non-human intelligence, crash retrievals, and 70 years of silence? There was a time where that might have worked, a time when the world still trusted official narratives, when propaganda could shape consensus, and when secrets could be buried under the weight of authority. But we no longer live in that world. The cost of secrecy grows every year. Revealing only the energy breakthrough is not a clean solution. It creates questions rather than extinguishing them. A power source that bends physics, operates without conventional fuel, produces no exhaust, and hints at limitless abundance, does not appear in a vacuum. People will ask where it came from. People will ask what it can do. And they'll ask what else has been hidden and for how long. It leaves compartmentalization intact, but removes the incentive to maintain it. The energy becomes public, the patents are filed, companies are formed. But the narrative remains constrained, which means the costs of secrecy remain, while the strategic advantages begin to dissipate. And arguably, the entire reason for the secrecy also dissolves. And so we come to the explanation for why the truth has remained buried for so long. It's not metaphysical, it's not philosophical, it's economical. The prize has never been the knowledge of non-human intelligence. The prize has always been the energy. Power without fuel, mass without inertia, travel without limitation. For decades, secrecy was profitable. It preserved advantage. It preserved control. And it preserved those lucrative government contracts. But take away the prize, you simply take away the incentive to preserve secrecy. Whatever has been hidden was never guarded because humanity couldn't handle the truth. That is just an excuse. It was guarded because someone could profit from it. The truth, if it eventually arrives, will likely reveal a story without heroes. A long, unglamorous era where world-altering technology was withheld because its release would destabilize the system before those who controlled it were ready to capitalize. Not exactly the kind of story that looks noble on a podium, but one that aligns perfectly with history, with power, and with human nature. At a certain point, when it is no longer profitable, when the cost of secrecy exceeds the value of denial, the door will open, and it won't be because of some sacred truth, or because humanity is ready, but because someone somewhere finally did the maths and discovered that the future was more necessary than the silence. So by now, we've defined the monumental age we find ourselves in, a landscape reshaped by technological upheaval and cultural drift, a slow but relentless shift in politics, science and belief. One way or another, change is coming, not as spectacle, but as a gradual erosion of the world we used to recognize. Yet a lingering question hangs in the air. Is any of this truly enough to create the disclosure we've been waiting for? Would an official announcement, the moment so many imagine, actually land with the force we expect? Would it transform the world overnight? Or would it dissolve into the noise of a civilization already overwhelmed? We certainly live in an extraordinary time, filled with pressure and possibilities that previous generations could scarcely imagine. But a strange uncertainty remains. Are we actually living in the age of disclosure, or merely in some strange prelude to it? Before we picture that moment, the statement, the curtain lifting, let's take a clear-eyed look at the world as it is today, and the forces that are fueling the fire beneath it. If you step back from the noise, the pattern is clearly visible. Pilots coming forward on camera, whistleblowers filing legal complaints, Congress holding hearings under oath, scientists one by one giving way to the possibility of contact, documentaries featuring senators, admirals, and former heads of intelligence speaking plainly about non-human craft. Sightings increasing, and no longer mocked. Military language shifting from ridicule to operational concern, to talking points in press briefings. All of it framed quietly, relentlessly, as unexplained, unknown, unclassified, and unusual. No panic, no revelation, no spectacle. Slow normalization. A culture being prepared to hear something extraordinary without fainting or rioting. This is the age we live in, the age of disclosure. But what does our moment of disclosure look like? Or rather, what does it not look like? What it does not resemble is a Hollywood fantasy. No mass data dump, no open access to every classified file, no line-by-line confession of 70 years of secrecy. Institutions do not survive radical transparency, and governments do not voluntarily dismantle their own leverage. I'm sorry to disappoint, but our moment, if it arrives, it too will be incremental, controlled, and strictly instrumental. Not a cleansing of truth. It will be a controlled burn. Even when disclosure takes place on a world stage, the phrase, "the world you thought you lived in was a lie," is unlikely to make the final draft. But for better or worse, our imagination is still wired for ceremony, for closure, for history with a timestamp. So let's talk about what that moment might look like, should history decide to grant us one. In the Western world, there is only one office with the authority to define that moment: the President of the United States. Not because other nations don't matter, but because the US holds both the infrastructure and the global narrative machinery to shape how the planet receives its news. If the current American president, who, according to multiple insiders, including David Grush, has been read into some level of the phenomenon, were to be granted permission to speak, and if that president were Donald Trump, it is difficult to imagine him declining the opportunity. The speech would become the most important address ever delivered by a head of state. A legacy moment, a textbook moment, a century-defining moment. And anyone, regardless of ideology, could be forgiven for wanting to be the person to introduce humanity into that new paradigm. I certainly would. But here is where expectation must be grounded. The role of government, after all, is not to enlighten the public. It is to maintain order, stabilize institutions, protect national security, and preserve economic continuity. Any disclosure speech would be built within those boundaries. It would communicate the minimum necessary information to achieve the goals of policymakers and avoid destabilizing the system that sustains them. That means limited data, carefully curated language, and as mundane as it sounds, absolutely no shift in the financial architecture of the world. And this leads us to timing. If the announcement ever comes, the timing would likely be strategic. A Friday evening after global markets close. No immediate trading, no overnight panic. 2 days of breathing room for analysts, governments, and media ecosystems to build a coherent narrative. And yes, Friday evening is also primetime television. In other words, it's a moment calibrated for both stability, and reach. The message would be narrow, precise, and unfortunately incomplete. No mention of long-standing secrecy, crash retrieval programs, psionics, contact, agreements, abductions, or metaphysical implications. No stories of past decades, no apologies, certainly no confessions. The threat narrative would remain ambiguous, but the public would be reassured that no hostile intent had been observed. A subtle dance between caution and calm. Paradoxically, the one truth that needs to be spoken, the driving force behind the need for disclosure, would likely also not be shared, at least not directly. That revelation of limitless fossil-free energy cannot be delivered cleanly. A society built on energy scarcity cannot survive overnight abundance. Currencies would collapse, corporations disintegrate, infrastructure would become obsolete, power structures would dissolve. So the technology would be referenced carefully, imprecisely, as a field of study, not a finished reality. Enough to spark hope, not enough to spark revolution. Enough to warrant dissemination of such technology to the government's, quote, trusted partners for study and application exploration. But absolutely not something you'll be charging your iPhone off anytime soon. And that, perhaps, is the most sobering part of this whole conversation. Disclosure will not resemble the visionary awakening that many of us imagined. To paraphrase one of my favourite series, Stranger Things, it will resemble a watered-down beverage, poured by an institution that knows its audience cannot handle a straight pour. A truth adjusted to human tolerance, a reality filtered through economics, a revelation translated into policy. Because when information is too strong, people call bullshit. They reject it, they mock it, they ignore it. Not because the truth is false, but because the truth is undrinkable. And history has shown again and again that humanity prefers a diluted truth to a pure one. So, if the truth must be watered down to be tolerated, either by us or by the structural foundations of society itself, then I think it's worth considering whether we've already been served that drink by quote-unquote whistleblowers, by books, and by films. We may indeed be living in the age of disclosure, but let's now return to the film at the centre of all this, a work that carries extraordinary claims, yet delivers them with sobering calm, like someone pouring a drink they know might be too strong. This isn't a simple story of heroes and villains, of shadowy masterminds battling brave whistleblowers, or of noble truth-seekers confronting malevolent secrecy. The real landscape is far stranger and far more entangled. So let me begin with a question that, if you haven't already asked, you probably should. If you knew disclosure had to happen, and you knew the clock was ticking, would you allow someone else to define that moment? If you had held the most consequential secret in human history for 7 decades, do you think you'd surrender the microphone at the moment of revelation? Control is habit-forming. Power creates continuity. Narrative becomes infrastructure. And if you've kept the secret this long, it's very unlikely you'd let disclosure unfold without shaping the terms. Not because you're evil, but because you've lived with the consequences of knowing what the public does not. With that in mind, it's worth being honest about something. The age of disclosure was not made for people like me, and it probably wasn't made for people like you. It was not made for the obsessive researcher, the experiencer, the lifelong witness, the person who lost sleep over this long before 2023. It was made for the uninitiated, the people who needed a crash course in the landscape, delivered in a digestible format, without requiring them to drink the whole bottle at once. More importantly, it was made for people with power, for lawmakers, intelligence officials, and high-level decision-makers who might finally be willing to take this seriously if it arrived wrapped in authority and spoke with institutional calm. It is a film that doesn't try to convince the public. It tries to educate the establishment. And crucially, let's not pretend this was a rogue production. Everything spoken by US officials in that film passed through the DOPSA process, the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review. DOPSA doesn't evaluate whether something is true. It evaluates whether saying it publicly is acceptable within national security constraints. The government didn't stop this film. It signed off on it. That doesn't mean the interviewees are puppets of the legacy program. But, if such a program exists, and it is trying to manage disclosure on its own terms, this is exactly where its representatives would appear. Not waving flags, not revealing everything, but shaping the story. Not because they're villains, but because their relationship to disclosure is far more complicated than either side admits. People in legacy programs can genuinely want disclosure for the benefit of humanity, and also fear that uncontrolled disclosure would expose decades of illegal activity, fraud, perjury, and worse. Those two impulses can coexist in the same human heart. This complexity is reflected in what the film includes, and perhaps more tellingly, what it avoids. There is almost nothing in it on consciousness, psionics, contact phenomena, abductions, or the nature of the intelligence itself. These are the whiskey sours of ufology. You can't water them down without ruining the drink. Their omission may be practical, too much, too fast for newcomers, but it also raises a fair question. Would discussing those topics serve a controlled, managed disclosure, or would it unleash questions that can't be answered without self-incrimination? Would acknowledging those aspects expose the people who kept the secret, the mechanics of the cover-up, or the full scope of the programs still hidden? Or would DOPSA simply refuse to clear it? We can't know, but it's worth asking. It is possible, even likely, that some of the people closest to this secret want disclosure genuinely and urgently. It's also possible, even likely, that some fear exposure not because of the truth itself, but because of what the truth reveals about their own actions. Those motivations are not mutually exclusive. Human beings are complicated, institutions even more so. You can be part of the problem and also part of the solution. And yet, Despite the film's omissions, its cautious tone, its obviously strategic restraint, there is something extraordinary about watching a Secretary of State look into a camera and express belief that the United States has recovered technology of non-human origin. In my lifetime, that was unthinkable. Whatever criticisms we have about the film's boundaries and omissions, let's not pretend that moment means nothing. Because it means everything. It means the Overton window has moved so far, so fast, that we barely noticed the hinge. It means that the talking, debating, arguing, investigating, fighting has brought us to a moment when statements of existential magnitude can be spoken calmly, on camera, without ending careers. The world did not change overnight, but it appears the language did, and language is how reality transforms. We are in the age of disclosure, albeit a fragmented one. The task before us is not purity of belief or unanimity of theory. It's dialogue, collaboration, persistence, curiosity, humility, pressure, patience, and audacity. We need skeptics and believers, scientists and experiencers, insiders and outsiders, whistleblowers and archivists, podcasters and policymakers. We need everyone, because a truthful and complete disclosure will not emerge from a single voice, or a single film, or a single revelation. It will emerge from the friction of many voices speaking their small portion of the truth as they know it. A lie does not become truth by telling another lie. But truth can become reality if enough of us insist on it, and insist calmly, bravely, and relentlessly together. Thanks for spending another night with us here at the Dreamland Motel. As things continue to shift, stay curious, stay awake, and keep both eyes open. Not everything you'll be told is the whole story, and every narrative has someone who benefits from it. So listen closely, ask the quiet questions, and we'll meet again soon. Good night.